Jill, thanks very much for the warm introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here and join you tonight and have the opportunity to discuss with you and share ideas about economic inequality and its implications for today's economy, and perhaps most importantly, ideas about restoring prosperity for all Americans. And I noted a moment ago that one of the principles behind the Show Me Institute is, I believe, freedom comes first. And when we get to the point of my remarks where we talk about restoring prosperity, you'll see that enhancing personal freedom, enhancing economic freedom will be critical for advancing our society's opportunities to move our economy forward. Well, we lived through an election last fall where economic inequality became just an enormous political issue. And one couldn't pick up a newspaper, look at a media outlet, and not see some discussion about inequality. And where President Obama stood on economic inequality and where Governor Romney stood on economic inequality. And we saw what was really unprecedented last fall, which was President Obama achieving re-election despite the fact that historically no sitting president had been re-elected who had presided over previous 4 years of such a weak economy. What I mean by that is that the employment rate, the number of jobs relative to the adult working age population, was actually lower at the time of the November elections than it had been when President Obama took office. And my take, and the take of a number of other economists and political scientists, is that President Obama was able to prevail over Governor Romney with a focus on concerns about inequality. Now, we all sat through the fall campaign period and we heard about Occupy Wall Street and President Obama's suggestion about the bucket rule, in which taxpayers would face a minimum 30% tax on income. We heard the president say many times the rich don't pay their fair share. You didn't build that. We heard about Governor Romney's remark about the 47% of Americans who wouldn't probably support him. And we were confronted with many alleged facts about inequality. And one point of my remarks tonight will be to make the point that a lot of what you hear about economic equality is misleading, in some cases false, and that many proposals to, quote, address, unquote, inequality will damage our economic future, and in fact potentially severely damage the economic opportunities of those Americans, young people, individuals who are still in school, individuals who haven't had the opportunity or the time to build up a stock of human capital skills to compete in the workplace. Those individuals may be damaged the most. So when I mentioned that inequality was such an important factor in the fall elections, I'm showing you a picture here. And the blue is the modal, or the most often cited response for preferring President Obama. And you can see that the graph begins in January 2012 and continues through October 2012, just before the election. So this blue line shows the number of people expressing a preference for voting for President Obama, and the red is those expressing a preference to vote for Governor Romney. And all the red dots and blue dots are all results from many individual polls, the hundreds of polls that are done in America. And the red is essentially a distillation of all the red dots, and the blue curve is a distillation of all the blue dots. And the graph tells a fairly simple story, which is that early on, the president had a substantial lead over Governor Romney, and that narrowed. And it narrowed substantially after the first debate between President Obama and Governor Romney. So there's very little difference in terms of survey respondents' self-reported preferences for whom they would vote for. But then after that, you see a sharp division. You suddenly see a large increase in those expressing a preference to vote for President Obama re-election, and a sharp decline in those expressing a preference for Governor Romney. And what's the timing of that? That was after Governor Romney's 47% remark. And the President and the Democratic Party jumped all over that, and voters responded very, very considerably, as you can see from the graph. And Governor Romney, and at least in my opinion, didn't really have much of a chance after that. So when we say inequality is now up front and center in politics and the economy, it certainly is. And many of the President's remarks and his intentions towards economic policy have been to address economic inequality. Okay, so let's talk about inequality, and let's talk about the facts and what they mean for society and for the U.S. economy. Well, something that is continuously reported is that inequality is increasing. What I talk about is that that's not true for the most reasonable measures of income and after correcting for taxes. Inequality is not increasing. In fact, if anything, it's gone down. Another claim made by many, including the President, is that middle-class incomes are stagnant. That's not true. Another claim is that tax rates on the highest earners are lower than on others. And certainly you read this if you follow Warren Buffett's op-ed piece in the New York Times and continued discussions by Warren Buffett and the President's remarks about Warren Buffett, how his secretary paid lower taxes, tax rates. Well, no, this is not true. Another claim made by the President, American top earners don't pay their fair share. Well, fair share is really in the eyes of the beholder. But what we can make is relative comparisons between the United States and other advanced countries, such as those in Europe, Canada, and so forth. And what we'll see there is that really the only answer, the only conclusion to draw about fair share, comparing the U.S. to other countries, is no. And during my remarks, I'm going to draw on a few pieces that I've been involved with. One is a piece called The Mismeasure of Inequality, written with Kip Hagopian. It appeared in Hoover Institution Policy Review last summer. Government Policies and the Delayed Economic Recovery, which is a book I edited with John Taylor, who's at Stanford, and Ian Wright, who's at Stanford. And a Wall Street Journal op-ed I wrote with Ed Prescott that appeared last December called Tax Rates Are Higher Than You Think. And if you're interested in reading more about these, I'll make sure that the Institute has the internet links for these pieces. Okay, so let's talk about details about changes in inequality over time. So recently the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, reported that inequality rose between 1979 and 2007. Now, when we hear statistics like this, it's important to ask, well, what do you actually mean by inequality? Now, the Census Bureau is the bureau responsible for most studies on inequality. And the Census Bureau typically reports measures of differences in income across the population of households based on something called money income, which is simply just earned income. But it doesn't include transfer payments. It doesn't include capital income, including imputed rent on owner-occupied housing. It leaves out a lot of income, and moreover, it doesn't correct for taxes. When we think about economic well-being of one household versus another, what we need to measure are what are the resources available to that household after taxes and after all sources of income and support are provided. Well, Hagopian and I measured that. And what we came up with is that, well, between 1979 and 2007, inequality, that is differences in income using the broadest measure of income, including transfer payments, capital income, and adjusting for all federal taxes, actually declined a little bit. Now, moreover, when you hear statistics about changes in inequality, it's almost always related to income. But as economists, the economists care about how much consumption is being undertaken in the household. And sources for consumption may differ from income. Well, consumption inequality has declined considerably. In fact, has declined about 12% since 1990. Not only that, inequality or differences in consumption, consumer spending across households is very substantially overstated, just for the simple reason that lower income households eat far fewer meals out in restaurants, tend to do more home repairs, tend to hire fewer babysitters and nannies and engage in child care, whereas high income households prepare relatively few meals at the home, typically don't take care of home cleaning and maintenance on their own, and hire many babysitters and nannies. That's simply just a substitution for paying someone, a nanny, to do a job that one might do on their own, taking care of children. So inequality is reflected by consumer spending, or consumption is much lower than what has been reported, and in fact has declined over time. What about the stagnant middle class? During the President's inaugural address, he spoke many times about the middle class hasn't had a chance in many years, has not experienced or enjoyed any of the economic growth. The President made the point, many others make the point or argue, that all of the benefits of economic growth in the last 30 years have gone to the top 1% or top 5%. Well, that's not true. Middle incomes grew 44% since 1979. It's certainly true that top income brackets grew much faster, and the lowest income brackets grew much slower. But let me go back to my point about consumer spending versus income. Take a look at households who are reported by the census to be at the poverty level. And for a household of 4, that number is about $23,000 per year. However, consumer spending surveys conducted by the census shows that the average consumption level for that same household, having an income of about $23,000 per year, it's actually about $44,000 per year. So the poorest households, and make no mistake, too many Americans are poor, too many Americans struggle, but the simple point in getting the facts right is that consumption is almost twice as high as just earned income for many of these households, and this reflects many government programs, including the expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit, welfare and transfer programs, etc. Now you might say, well, what does that mean in terms of how well is our economic well-being compared to other countries? Well, that $44,000 per year of consumer spending, that's substantially higher than the median European household. Not only that, the size of housing that poverty level households live in is about twice as high as the amount of housing the median European lives in. I'm going to show you a table here that shows income growth across quintiles. Quintiles simply take the population of households and divide them up into 5 bins. The lowest income quintile will be those from 0 to 20%. The second quintile will be from 21 to 40%, etc. And what I've done here is I've reported the growth in inflation-adjusted income that these different households have achieved from 1 through 5 quintiles, as well as the top 1%. And what you'll see are the numbers that are typically reported to you, and those numbers are right here that are typically reported. And these are incomes that are put into inflation-adjusted terms using the Consumer Price Index. Well, the Consumer Price Index is a bad measure of inflation. For a number of reasons, it overstates inflation. better measure of inflation is something called the personal consumption expenditure deflator. Now, without going into the technical issues between the PCE and the CPI, virtually all economists agree that adjusting incomes using the personal consumption expenditure deflator is far superior to doing that using the consumer price index. And what we see is fairly large differences in how fast incomes are growing. For example, if we look at the poorest households, those in the first quintile, that is households that are in the bottom 80 to 100% of poor households, their income growth is about 26% using the personal consumption expenditure deflator compared to 18% using the consumer price index. It's almost a 50% difference. And when we talk about middle class, well, I like to think of the U.S. living in what I hope to be a classless society where everybody has the opportunity to achieve what they wish to achieve. But if we look at the third quintile, those people are actually in the middle. Those people between 40% to 60% of households. Well, they have about 44% income growth. Now, if you want to call that stagnant, you can call that stagnant, and that though they're not going anywhere, but I think most of us would agree up by 44% is up by 44%. So are middle class income stagnant? No, they're not. Everyone is benefiting from economic growth, but it is true that the most productive and the most skilled earners are achieving the highest gains. Okay, well, everyone's incomes are moving forward. A little bit later we'll talk about how we can get the lowest income Americans to move forward even faster. What about paying taxes? Paying taxes has always been one of the most polarizing issues in the history of American politics. It's no different now. If anything, it might even be more polarizing because of all the attention it's received. As I mentioned earlier, the president says, we just want those rich folks to pay their fair share. And he proposed the Buffett rule. People have to pay, high income earners have to pay a minimum of 30%. Well, what about the Buffett rule? And the idea that his secretary paid a higher tax rate than he did because so much of his income comes from capital income. Well, that's false. And Mr. Buffett, I think, knows that. Mr. Buffett and other very high income Americans who receive a lot of their income from capital sources, that income has already been taxed once at the corporate level at statutory rates as high as 35%. Factor in taxation of corporate profits, well, what happens? What does that average high income earner pay? Well, their average tax rate is about 19%. It's not, and this is just for income taxes, this doesn't include that corporate tax. But even not including the corporate tax, the top earners pay a higher income tax rate. And that's for all income taxes as well as all federal taxes. So is it the case that the rich don't pay their fair share, that they pay lower tax rates than low-income individuals? No. What about more broadly? Not just the top 1/10 of 1%, but what about the entire U.S. tax schedule? Well, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development is a collection of roughly 25 advanced countries. The United States, Canada, most of Western Europe, Northern Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. The highest income countries are those that are members of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. The International Monetary Fund, which is a research organization that's headquartered in Washington, D.C., and that aids all countries, but primarily middle-income and low-income countries, did a study. And the International Monetary Fund asked, well, which country has the most progressive tax schedule? Progressive tax schedule meaning how fast does the tax rate increase as one's taxable income increases. They compared the US to Germany and France, Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, all those countries in the OECD. What they found is the US income tax system is not only highly progressive, meaning that tax rates rise quickly as taxable income rises, but in addition is the most highly progressive tax schedule in the world among all advanced countries. So when we ask, well, do the rich pay their fair share? Fair share is in the eye of the beholder, but we can make comparisons across countries. High income earners in this country pay relatively more than in any other country, including Scandinavian countries such as Sweden, Norway, Finland, Germany, France. What else can we say about changes in taxes over time? Well, low-income earners have received the largest rate reductions going back to the Reagan tax cuts of the early 1980s. And in fact, this is why. When Governor Romney made the remark, well, we've got 47% of people that are on the government dole, and he was very impolitic when he made those remarks. But this is, from the factual standpoint, what he was referring to is that about half of the country, in terms of taxpayers, and this is not meant to be pejorative in any way, but some of the fact is about the lowest 50% taxpayers pay very little in the way of income taxes. And what you see is that the bottom 50% pay about 2.3% of all income taxes. They receive about 13.5% of all income. So about 98% of income taxes are paid by the top 50%. And in fact, the great majority of that is paid by the top 5%. So what you can see in this table, the first column reports percent of income earned by top 1%, 5%, 10%, and the percent of taxes paid. And this is where you can see why the International Monetary Fund graded the United States as having the most progressive tax schedule. That is, taxes paid relative to the share of income earned by a particular group. See, the top 1% accounted for about 17% of income. They paid about 37% of federal income taxes. Top 5% accounted for about 32% of income. They come close to paying about 60% of all income taxes. So when we ask ourselves, where are tax dollars coming from? You might listen to certain remarks. Rich don't pay their fair share. They pay much lower tax rates than other Americans. We just want them to pay their fair share. This is not the picture you would be thinking of when you hear those remarks. But again, right now we're just talking about getting the facts on the table, and these are the facts. I'll return later in a few minutes when we talk about my views about restoring prosperity to the problems that we face with these types of numbers. I briefly showed you this picture before, which was average tax rates by income class, and you can see that either for income taxes or for all federal taxes, including Social Security, Medicare, excise and consumption taxes, highest earners, the very top earners pay the most, the lowest earners pay the least. So then when we talk about taxes and what is the picture that comes out of America, again, these are the facts, but I don't think this is the table that would jump to mind based on certain media reports. Now, America is an unequal society in terms of income. We have people that generate enormous incomes and wealth and others that don't. Now, before we talk about trying to advance opportunities for the lowest income earners, the point I want to make now is that inequality is a necessary and, in fact, natural component of a dynamic, vibrant, growing economy. Any successful market economy Any of them. You look at China today, they're advancing. What's happening in inequality? It's growing. All successful market economies, what I mean by successful is that they become rich and achieve high levels of economic growth. It requires high inequality. It requires people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Fred Smith of FedEx and Larry Ellison of Oracle and Larry Bezos of Amazon.com. It requires creative and innovative, imaginative risk takers to put their capital on the line and to try out ideas in the marketplace. And to generate people that have had this level of success requires thousands of attempts. So for every Bill Gates, there's another 4,000 or 5,000 that did not achieve anything close to that. But when we look at those names, these are American heroes. From the standpoint, they became enormously wealthy as a consequence of taking risks and putting their creative ideas in the marketplace. But when I say they're American heroes, what I mean by that is that they are people I call the creators of society surplus. Because the value of what Gates and Jobs and Fred Smith and others on that list created, the value of what they created for our society is enormous relative to what they directly received. So in other words, these people are billionaires, but the value they developed for our society is hundreds and hundreds of times what they received. We are beneficiaries of these people. We are beneficiaries of physicians and engineers that create new drugs and new products that advance health and lifespan. We need these people. We can't have a successful economy without these people, and this generates inequality. But we are all better off for it. Now, Europe has less inequality. There's no doubt about that. But it's not a vibrant economy. There's much less risk-taking, much less entrepreneurship, lower economic growth. So I'm going to, as a professor, I can throw out an occasional trick question to the audience. First trick question, how many recent European startups, recent meaning early 1970s, achieved the same level of success that these corporations did? Yes, sir?
One.
I didn't plan in the audience, but one is the correct answer. It's one with an asterisk. It is a Norwegian oil company. They happen to be sitting in an enormous pool of North Sea oil. So I'll put an asterisk on that. There were two I think one in England and one in Ireland. But Continental Europe has generated one that's achieved the same level of success. And it was oil on the ground. Could have they done better? They didn't. Because they didn't have people taking risk. And why is that? European economic policies that depress incentives to take risk through high tax rates, high startup costs, generally non-market-based policies. Second, so far you're batting 1,000. I know the Cardinals had a game day today, so I'll stay with the baseball analogy. How many more French work today than in 1955? Yes, sir? None. Okay, you're tough. Fewer people work in France today in 1955. And that's not adjusting per capita. Just flat out, fewer people work in France today than in 1955. And there's been population growth in France. What kind of economy would we be if we had fewer people working today than in 1955? It's not just France. Germany, Sweden, Norway. Anybody here from Belgium? Belgium extraction? Belgium entered the Great Depression in 1929. There were fewer people working today in Belgium than in 1929. They won the Great Depression that really came out of it. We've seen what chronic and continuous application of non-market-based policies does to successful economies. That's what happened in Europe. We don't want to become Europe. But some of our policies are pushing us in that direction. The key problem isn't inequality. It's not inequality. Because we can have an unequal society and have everyone succeed and have a high living standard. It's the failure to restore economic growth following the very severe recession we had. We've lost nearly 4 years of GDP growth, and we're falling far below trend. Our employment rate, that is the number of jobs divided by the working age population, that's back to 1970s levels. This, not inequality, is depressing America. So this is one of my favorite pictures. This shows real GDP, gross domestic product, output, market value of output per person, relative to our traditional 2% trend. Now, because they manage to compound interest, economists and statisticians and actuaries have this thing called the rule of 70. It means that take something that's growing at a particular rate, scale it up by a factor of 70, not 100, to see how fast it doubles, which means growing at 2% a year, we double per capita income every 35 years. So, to the extent that lifespan in America is about 80 years now, that means people are achieving a 4 to 5 times increase in standard of living, inflation-adjusted income per capita. The red dashes are our 2% annual trend, but the blue is where we are, and you can see how far of a gap there is. There's about a 14% gap. We're 14% below where we should be. How about employment? Well, again, if you read a lot of media reports, it'll talk about the U.S. economy created so many jobs last month or in 2012. Well, here's the numbers. Rather than as I'm simply taking the number of jobs divided by the working age population, which is usually considered to be 16 to 64. And you can see we had an 8% drop in employment. It's about 15 million jobs, and it hasn't come back. And I've also drawn in this picture various government interventions. TARP was the Troubled Asset Relief Program. The ARRA was President Obama's stimulus plan, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. That was an $800 billion amalgam of spending and tax cuts. We had the new home buyer tax credit. We had cash for clunkers. We had payroll tax holidays. We had the Federal Reserve engaging in QE2 and QE3. My mother thought it was like a cruise ship. No, this is quantitative easing. All these, the grass clutter, all these various government policies don't seem to have done much to restore jobs. We are about 12 million jobs short of where we should be. We don't have a healthy economy. What's wrong? Marginal tax rates are much too high. And not just for the top, for almost everyone. The Congressional Budget Office has constructed measures of marginal tax rates. That's the tax rate an individual faces when they consider working a little bit more. Think about how much does one additional dollar of income buy you? One additional dollar of income buys only about 60 cents of consumption for the average earner. That is after you pay income taxes and after you pay sales taxes. So in other words, I'm thinking about earning one more dollar. How much do I buy? How much do I bring back from the grocery store? Only about 60 cents on the dollar. This is not at the very top. This is for average. So this Wall Street Journal editorial piece I did with Ed Prescott, we talked about these marginal tax rates, and we talked about how they were about 40%, very high level for the average earner. And at the for highest earners, in particular in high tax states such as my state of California, those combined rates are 65%. Now, we often have different ideas about what's ethical and what's fair and what's moral. 65% is, I'm a numbers guy, 65% is 65%. Any golfers in the audience? Okay, Phil Mickelson. Phil Mickelson said, I can't afford to live in the state of California anymore. Taxes are too high. And he was lambasted for saying that. And what's even worse is that marginal tax rates for many low earners can be as high as 100%. What do they mean by that? The Welfare Commissioner in the state of Pennsylvania did a calculation. He asked for a single parent with 2 children earning $28,000 per year, and he compared that individual to how well off they would be if they were earning $60,000 per year. They're better off at $28,000. Because the $28,000 they receive, the earned income tax credit, various types of supplementary income programs, children's health insurance, food stamps, they actually have greater take-home pay and payment in kind than at $60,000 per year when they're paying taxes. And now, it's important that society provides support and insurance for low-income earners, but we have to do a better job. We can't penalize individuals. And in fact, I had the good fortune to be a part-time resident in St. Louis in the fall of 2011. I was a visiting professor at WashU, and I was also a consultant to the St. Louis Fed. And I was living in University City with a friend of mine who was teaching at WashU. So I would take the train down to the St. Louis Fed. And one day I'm sitting in the train, right across the aisle from me is a young woman. I'm not so good with ages, I'm guessing she was around 20, and she was sitting with her friend. And she made the almost verbatim, she said, I just got offered this promotion. The woman said, oh, that's great. She said, I've made calculations, and I will lose my earned income tax credit if I take this promotion. I'm worse off with this promotion, so I'm going to turn it down. We don't want that. This was a talented person, young, who was moving up, who was succeeding. We want them to take promotions. We don't want them to turn them down. This is a problem with our tax code. Reducing the size of government. I think it's a pretty easy problem. I guess politically it's pretty tough. I mean, do we need a $155 billion Department of Agriculture? The Ag Department started in 1879. 60% of us worked on the farm. Today, 1.5% of us work on the farm. $50 billion Department of Energy that hands out $12 billion of subsidies to wind power that otherwise would not be economically competitive and may never be economically competitive. $50 billion Department of Housing. There's $1.3 trillion per year in discretionary spending. If it was my judgment, I would phase in cuts to all these subsidies over a 5-year plan and only keep the ones that pass the strict cost-benefit test. Cutting federal spending and all the concern about cutting $84 billion that occurred under the sequester plan, you could simply eliminate most agricultural subsidies and energy subsidies and you wouldn't have to touch one other thing. The government had the opportunity to make those types of cuts, and they chose not to do that. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and close up here. Just 2 more points. What else do we do to restore prosperity? Equalize economic opportunity for all. We want all of our citizens to succeed and have the opportunity to do so. For low earners, the problems they face are a long-term decline in public education outcomes and globalization. We can't do much about globalization. It's just going to continue to move forward whether we want it to or not. But we can do something about public school education outcomes. For my generation, public schools prepared me pretty well. What I mean by that is it gave me a background where I could compete. We don't do that so much anymore. Only 30% of U.S. high school grads are proficient in math and science. Only 7% pass at the advanced level. In my state, only 24% of high school graduates are proficient. That's kind of about on par with Greece. You see where they're going. The poorest states, such as New Mexico, Mississippi, Alabama, their proficiency rates are on par with Serbia, Croatia, and Kazakhstan. Very poor countries that simply don't have the resources to devote to education. Teachers' unions, almost all research shows, are part of the problem. But it's an easy fix. Unions protect poorly performing teachers through a tenure system and impose merit-based pay. We therefore keep some people who are probably well-intentioned but maybe just shouldn't be in the classroom, and we lose a lot of great teachers who say, hey, I can make money elsewhere. I'm just getting the same salary as these other people. We've got to do better, and it will be an enormous benefit to society if we do. Research shows that an individual who goes through K through 12 with about a 25th percentile teacher, that is 3 out of 4 or better teachers, they lose about $400,000 a lifetime income. And poorest neighbors tend to have the poorest schools. We've got to do a better job, and we can do a better job. My last point, immigration reform. We need to recruit high-skilled immigrants because they invest in starting businesses. 50% of Silicon Valley starts by immigrants, primarily Chinese and Indian. But the visas that these individuals are in this country for are capped. 65,000 per year. That number was set back in 1980. Not only capped at a total number, but capped by country. The good news is that there are a number of bills in both the House and the Senate that solves a lot of these problems, and I'm hopeful that we'll have a chance for meaningful immigration reform. So, the principles of the Show Me Institute, advancing freedom and liberty, is very much the heart of what I think is necessary to restore prosperity. We need to give everybody the opportunity to succeed. Right now we're not doing that, and I think we'll continue to suffer and pay the price, particularly for the people we really want to help, until we make some of these changes. Thank you very much. I will be happy to take comments and questions.